Good day, Ron Grimmels here with a new DCS video, and this time flying the Su-33 Flanker D a bit, which recently got its new professional flight model, leaving only the MiG-29 as the last Flaming Cliff 3 plane that still uses the older standard flight model. Now, I did not have much time for DCS recently, but I always planned to cover their new modules when they are out, like the Harrier, the F-18 and the F-14. And all of them are carrier-capable planes in some way or another. And I always wanted to start taking a look at the Su-33, the only carrier fighter in DCS at the moment, before those came out, to get some training with the naval and carrier scenarios, and have at least some experience for the F-18 and the F-14 in carrier landings. Because I have to admit, so far I haven't done any jet carrier operations in DCS or any other flight simulator, so I am somewhat new to this. As I mentioned, the Su-33 only somewhat recently got its new flight model, and I preferred flying the Su-27 with its professional flight model instead. So it's about time I get into some naval aviation in DCS and start to learn the Su-33. So I started to learn the Su-33 in the last few days and had quite a bit of fun with flying it and training carrier landings and the like. Especially the carrier landings have proven to be quite entertaining and quite challenging if you want to do them right. And while I'm at it, I might as well make a video about the plane. Just a short one to get back into things, going first over the plane, the Su-33, explain some basics of it and how it differs from its land-based counterpart, the Su-27. But primarily I want to take a look at carrier operations, takeoff and landing from the Admiral Kuznetsov. Well, let's take a look at the Su-33. Which is of course the carrier variant of the Su-27 Flanker and shares most of its systems with the Su-27. I have already made a video of the Su-27 in the past, but let's go over some of the basics again, since it has been a while. Now, the Su-27 was, like its smaller short-range counterpart, the MiG-29, developed in response to the FX program that led to the F-15 Eagle. Experience with preceding second and third generation fighters in Vietnam and the Middle East had at this point shown that maneuvering combat was against expectations, far from that, and as a matter of fact, advances in missile technology actually led to the maneuverability gaining importance instead of the other way around. Because with better and better engagement envelopes on the newer missiles and all aspect capable infrared missiles being introduced, it becomes more and more difficult to avoid fire from a slower but more maneuverable opponent by extending either in the horizontal or in the vertical as you would have done in the past. As a result, maneuvering to avoid fire from an opponent in a close dogfight became more important, and advances in computer technology and aerodynamics allowed to build planes to suit those needs and have a lot more maneuverability at slower speeds while maintaining a high top speed. So the resulting planes, these days usually called fourth generation fighters like the Su-27 and 33, the MiG-29, F-16 or F-15 for example, were the first generation of fighters that as a whole were more maneuverable than the preceding generation of fighters. Till then, new fighter generations were generally faster than the preceding one, but had worse slow speed handling and maneuverability, with some exceptions like the A6M0 in World War II for example. So the Flanker, despite its size, is very maneuverable, with a low effective wing loading and the ability to sustain high angles of attack. Now, those are of course also useful traits for a carrier-borne fighter to have, which wants to have the good slow speed handling for takeoff and landing on the carrier. Still, the Su-33 has in comparison to the Su-27 a slightly larger wing, as well as large canards on the leading edge extensions to further decrease the plane's landing speed and improve slow speed handling. On top of that, the Su-33 has of course the typical modifications you would expect from a carrier fighter compared to its land-based counterpart. A reinforced airframe and landing gear to withstand hard deck landings and folding wings and elevators to take up less space on the carrier deck. The Su-33 also has a slightly different engine than the Su-27, with the ability to activate an emergency afterburner mode, which for a short time increases the thrust in full afterburner. The difference in thrust is however not that big, only a few %, so don't expect the same huge boost you for example get on the MiG-21's emergency afterburner. It's just a little bit extra to help take off when the plane is heavily loaded. So the Su-33 can be even more maneuverable in slow-speed maneuvering and combat than the Su-27. However, thanks to all the modifications for carrier operations, the plane is also a lot heavier than its land-based counterpart. The flanker in general is a very large plane, about the same size as an F-14 Tomcat, and the Su-33 has almost the same weight as an F-14, despite being a single-seat fighter. The extra weight of the Su-33 leads to a lower thrust-to-weight ratio on the Su-33 compared to the Su-27 or MiG-29. That is quite typical for Navy fighters though. The extra equipment needed for carrier operations simply leads to a heavier plane and a lower thrust-to-weight ratio. Now, the thrust-to-weight ratio is again somewhat comparable to that of an F-14B Tomcat with the F-100 engines, assuming similar fuel and weapon load. The thrust-to-weight ratio is still good though, over 0.9 with 50% fuel and a standard weapon load. So that is something to keep in mind when going up against fighters like the F-15 or the Su-27 for that matter. They will generally have a bit of a higher thrust-to-weight ratio and therefore a easier time keeping their speed up in maneuvering combat. Now, an advantage of the Su-33 size is its ability to carry a large amount of fuel internally as well as lots of weapons. The Su-33 can carry a maximum of 12 missiles. That's 2 more than the Su-27 and twice as much as a MiG-29. Those missiles are a typical mix of the semi-active radar-guided and infrared-guided R-27s, as well as the infrared-guided R-73 with its high off-bore sight ability. The Su-33 lacks more than active radar-guided missiles though, which puts it at a disadvantage in beyond visual range fights against the F-15 or the upcoming F-18 when they are equipped with AIM-120s. In close-range dogfights, the Su-33, like the Su-27 and MiG-29, can use its great maneuverability in combination with its helmet-mounted sight and the R-73's off-bore sight capability to its advantage to get the upper hand over F-15, though the Eagle has an edge in thrust-to-weight ratio, as already mentioned, over the Su-33. Now, with the upcoming F-18, it will be interesting to see how it turns out in a close-range dogfight. The F-18 is also highly maneuverable, like the flanker, but it doesn't have quite the thrust-to-weight ratio edge over the Su-33 that the Eagle has. With 50% fuel and standard air-to-air loadout, it's a bit higher than the Su-33's, but to be fair, the Su-33 at 50% fuel carries more fuel than the F-18 with a full tank. Now, as far as sensors go, the Su-33 has the same radar as the Su-27 and a similar electro-optical system, which can be used to scan for and track a target without using the radar and giving your position away that way. The electro-optic sensor also has a laser rangefinder, which is used to get the slant range in air-to-ground mode to provide a targeting solution for unguided air-to-ground munitions. When you switch between the radar and the electro-optical sensor though, keep in mind that the radar gives you a top-down view, like you would expect, while the infrared sensor does not. Being a passive infrared sensor, it can't tell the range to the targets it finds while scanning. So with the infrared sensor, it shows you the altitude in the vertical, not the range like the radar does. Well, that's some basic info on the Su-33. So with that out of the way, let's take a look at what makes this plane special in comparison with its land-based counterpart, the Su-27, its carrier capability, specifically the carrier landings and takeoffs in DCS with this plane. Now, the takeoff in the Su-33 is very straightforward and quite simple. The Admiral Kuznetsov is not equipped with steam catapults like the US carriers. Instead, you have a large ramp, somewhat comparable to a few British carriers. In order to take off, you hold the wheel brake, activate full afterburner with emergency mode if needed, release the brake, and then you just fly off the ramp and take off. The carrier generally steams into the wind to increase the indicated airspeed and help with takeoff and landings that way. Now, one important thing to keep in mind is the plane's weight. The Su-33 can take off from the carrier almost fully loaded, but only when taking off from the rear takeoff position. The Kuznetsov has 2 short takeoff positions in the front of the carrier, which are limited to a maximum takeoff weight of 27 tons, though that is pushing it in my opinion. I would not go over 25 on the front takeoff to be on the safe side. When you are heavier, there are 2 long takeoff positions further back, where you can go to 32 tons. The plane here has, for example, full fuel and 12 missiles and weighs 32.5 tons. However, by default you spawn on the short takeoff positions on the front of the carrier, so if you want to take off with a heavy loadout, you have to taxi back to the rear takeoff position. The two main takeoff runs are marked with yellow lines. Other than that, there is nothing too special about the takeoff from the Kuznetsov. The carrier should steam in the wind, though it does so at a bit of an angle, and we talk about why when we go over the landing, which gives you a bit of extra speed on takeoff, and you just accelerate towards the ramp as quick as you can manage and take off. Now, getting back down on the carrier is a bit of a different story. So let's talk about landing on the carrier, and then take a look at an example landing where I go into a bit more detail. Now, when you ask people how difficult landing the Su-33 in DCS is, I would guess there are basically two main group of answers. Those that are more or less winging it and don't care how they land, as long as they end up more or less on the deck in the end, will probably say it's not that hard. Those that want to do it properly, follow the glide slope, stay on the right angle of attack and so forth, are more likely to tell you that it's not that easy. And yeah, I think that most DCS players can more or less get the Su-33 down somehow, more often than not when just winging it. Doing it right is a bit of a challenge. Staying on the right glide slope, keeping your angle of attack, speed and altitude in check keeps you quite busy, as you might expect, and getting it right consistently takes some practice. I just started carrier training myself, so I'm not that good at it yet, but learning it has been a blast so far. Now, you might ask, why learn doing it the right way? Well, there are a few good reasons for that. First of all, consistency. While you might be able to get the plane down by just winging it, it won't be consistent. Sometimes it might work, the others it won't. And without consistent procedure as a baseline, it will be hard to tell why it worked when it did and why it didn't work when it failed. So even when you keep doing it that way, it will be hard to improve if you don't know what is going wrong or right. Or what if you have to land in bad weather or bad visibility? Winging it usually needs a good visibility to work. If you learn the proper procedure of landing on the carrier and after mastering it, you will be successful a lot more consistent, and when you fail, you will usually know where you went wrong and how to do it better next time. Also, learning it properly will of course help you with the F-18 and the F-14, and I expect specifically the F-14, which is a bit of an older plane, to be more challenging than the Su-33. And last but not least, it's just more fun that way. You have to constantly move the throttle and the stick, keep an eye on the glide slope and your angle of attack, and you just got a lot to do, and that is fun. Well, let's take a look at one of my training landings, and I point out some of the instruments and HUD symbology to keep an eye on, and other things I hope are useful, because one of the difficult things about the proper landing procedure for the Su-33 on the carrier landing is figuring out what the proper procedure is in the first place. The documentation is quite lacking in that regard. The Su-33's carrier training video in the game dates back to low make and is a bit outdated. Now here we just turned from the downwind leg to the initial point, which the navigation mode provides in return mode. It's about 12 kilometers out and about 1 kilometer altitude. Once you reach it, the nav system automatically switches to landing mode, though you can change to landing mode manually by pressing 1, and we extended gear, flaps and the hook. Let's go over the instruments. In the HUD in landing mode you got the glide slope indicator, the small circle, and the large director circle telling you where the glide slope is in relation to your plane, so if you're above or below the glide slope or to the side of it, and how to get on it. You want the small circle in the center of the large one. In this case that works a bit like the meatball on the carrier deck, which you can't see here. Except that the circle also tells you deviation to the left and right of the glide slope, not just high or low. Speed on approach is around 250 kph, though you have to adjust that depending on if you're high or low on the glide slope. The speed is here. Altitude is also in the HUD. The lower number is your current altitude from the radar altimeter, and the upper number is the altitude you should be on the glide slope. Keep in mind though that the glide slope ends on the carrier deck a few meters above the sea, while your radar altimeter shows you the altitude over the sea level, so there is a small offset. Now this instrument here is the angle of attack indication. When the green circle in the middle of the instrument is on, your angle of attack is good, about 10 degrees. When the upper yellow arrow is on, your angle of attack is too low. When the lower red arrow is on, your angle of attack is too high. both green and yellow means slightly low angle of attack, and both green and red means slightly high angle of attack. Now that is annoyingly exactly the other way around than it is on Western planes, something to keep in mind when you fly the F-18 or 14 when they come out. Now, last but not least, here is the rate of descent indicator. I try to go for about 5 meters per second on landing, but of course, if you are below the glide slope, you want a lower descent rate until you intercept the glide slope again, and when you're above it, you want a bit higher one till you're back on the glide slope. 5 meters per second is pretty harsh impact, but carrier planes are built to withstand a harder hit than land-based planes. You can get most of this information from your instruments in the cockpit as well, and often more accurate, but then you have to look down on them, so it is better to use the HUD symbology, at least in visual flying conditions. The circles in the HUD are also easier to use than the needles of the flight director in the HSI, I feel. So with those instruments explained, the basic idea is to hit the glide slope, meaning to line up the small and the large ring in the HUD, keep your angle of attack in the green, and then use the throttle to adjust your altitude if you drop below or get above the glide slope. And that way you should end up on the carrier deck. But of course that is easier said than done. I still have a tendency to try to adjust altitude with the angle of attack instead of speed like you should, and end up at the wrong angle of attack as a result. Also, with the carrier moving, the endpoint of the glide slope is not stationary, of course, and to make things even more interesting, the flight deck for landing is angled, of course, so you can't just come directly from behind the carrier when you line up the flight deck. That is also why the carrier will steam into the wind at an angle, not directly into the wind, so that you have a bit of a crosswind to help you adjust for approaching an angled flight deck. That is something to keep in mind when making missions with the Admiral Kuznetsov. And well, that was certainly not a perfect landing, I'm still training, but we are on the deck. In this example I did end up a bit below the glide slope, close to the carrier, and in adjusting sped up a bit too much and got above the glide slope right before touchdown, which made touchdown a bit more dicey than was planned. But those are the things one has to train for to get better at. And as mentioned before, thanks to trying to do it right, I know what went wrong in the end, and I can try to do better next time at this. Well, I found carrier landings in DCS to be more entertaining than expected, and I can't wait to try them with the F-18 and F-14 as well. But for now, this is it for this video. I hope it was informative, thanks for watching, and maybe I'll see you next time.